Hi, welcome back to a new webinar. My name is Pepijn Schoenmaker. So maybe you know me from my different marketing model videos, which are in 10 minutes. I talk you through this model. This video is a little bit different. It will take a bit longer because I'm gonna try to talk you kind of through the master thesis and what to expect and how to prepare. If you want to jump to a certain topic right away, you can look in the description below because I made some timestamps, and with those timestamps you can jump immediately to the topic that you want to hear about. So you are probably here because you're going to write your master thesis. Luckily we have a standard format which is worldwide known, and the standard format for the master thesis is really clear. Maybe you even have a course manual for your thesis. I really recommend that you use that manual to follow the steps that you have to do. I'm just here, I'm going to try to prepare you what to expect and give you some tips and tricks where I can. So, your topic. That's a typical thing that you really have to be sure about. Why? Because you're going to be stuck with the topic for all the months that you are working on your thesis. How do you find the topic? During your study, you had a lot of different courses. For instance, consumer behavior or digital or management or business-to-business marketing. Maybe there was a typical course that you really found exciting to follow, and maybe there were some papers that you enjoyed reading. Some of the papers you didn't enjoy, so better not take those for the topic, but the papers that you really enjoyed reading and that you also inspired you, those are the papers that probably have something for a topic that you might be interested in or that you can use for your thesis. Of course, not the same paper, but maybe in the further research section or perhaps there were certain sources in that paper that directed you towards a certain topic, or maybe you asked yourself how something worked, why wasn't something further researched. Maybe you can find a certain topic in one of those inspiring papers or in one of those inspiring courses. It's really handy if you already read that paper really well because you maybe had a test around that paper, so it's already in your head. That saves you a lot of time. Make sure that you have a topic that you like and enjoy, and don't switch your topic during your thesis. If you are 4 or 5 weeks in your thesis and then all of a sudden you start thinking, maybe I should have chosen a different topic, that's typically, it's normal that you think that, but don't go back, don't switch your topic. Once you've chosen that topic, you will stick with it. Now, if you have a strong feeling that you might have a good topic, start off with drawing your conceptual framework. It maybe sounds strange because you didn't do a literary review or whatever yet, but maybe when you start reading here and there just some abstracts and some discussions of certain papers that have a connection with your topic, start drawing boxes. Try to start organizing your different theories and organizing your thoughts. This is really handy also when you have your first meeting with your supervisor, that you can show them a conceptual framework, which obviously is a draft, but it's just your thoughts on paper, and really important, it structures your thoughts and you already can think ahead what you need to research. For instance, I'll show you this slide. It's always good to start off with an experiment. Most of the theses in marketing are an experiment with with 2 groups or 3 groups as an independent variable. So let's say you have group A and group B. Customer type A, customer type B. And you have the knowledge that when you manipulate customer type A with, for instance, a advertisement with a picture, and group B gets text. And you have theory that tells you that A will respond differently and this has an effect on brand attitude. But you also have the idea that there is a mediator, that if you do certain sales activities, that this will boost or that this will slow down certain effects on brand attitude. You can draw that box as well. And you read some theory that's also different between product A, say hedonic products, versus product B, utilitarian products. They moderate this effect. You already know now that you will need 4 groups to do research. So your survey will have to go to 4 different groups. Group A, picture with hedonic and the other group, utilitarian, and group B with text, utilitarian and hedonic. So you need 4 groups. So your sample size needs to be pretty big. If we put another group, group C, then this will be 6 groups and your survey needs to be way bigger. So this is why it's good to start off with drawing some boxes and also to find out how many theory do I need. Because I need theory on group A, group B, product A, product B, sales activity and brand attitude. So this is also your theoretical framework. So all these variables need to be discussed in your literary review or your theoretical framework. So if I would make it more complex, for instance, I'm going to add self-concept clarity and maybe even an extra group, it will be more complex and your thesis will be bigger and more robust. So it's good to draw out these boxes and don't make it too complex. It's not necessary. Okay? Now, another thing. I already told you this is also good for your first meeting with your supervisor. Make sure that you make a planning ahead. Most of the universities have a thesis manual, and the thesis manual also a lot of times has a planning. If it doesn't have a planning, make a planning yourself. But stick with that planning. Also, if it's given in the course manual, you really don't have to doubt that that planning is really good and well, and it has been tested over and over, so that will probably be a really realistic planning. If there is no planning, you make it yourself and you discuss it with your supervisor, because the supervisor can tell you, well, this is not realistic, take some more time for this, take some less time for that, etc., etc. And between all those chunks, for instance, after the introduction or after your theoretical framework or after research design, you can make appointments with your supervisor, already schedule them for a feedback loop. If that's an email or a face-to-face or on a video conferencing, it doesn't matter. But if you have those meetings already set, then you also have some deadlines where to work to, because you always have to hand in something at your feedback loop. When you have that feedback loop, make sure that you always hand in something which is within the APA 7 styles. Your thesis has to be in APA 7, so that means Times New Roman 12, double-spaced, outlined left and right, etc., etc. Make sure that every draft you send in to your supervisor has this format, because it's so much easier for the supervisor to read, okay? And make those appointments. And your supervisor is your best friend. Your supervisor is also someone which will grade you. So make sure that you have a good relationship with the supervisor, even though he or she responds late or is not complete or whatever, it doesn't matter. They have to grade you. And in the appendix of your course manual, very often you find the so-called rubrics or the assessment form. The assessment form tells you on different points where you are being assessed on. And that's not only your writing skills, it's not only if everything is neatly in your thesis, it's also how was your feedback loop? Did you do something with the feedback? Did you take any initiatives? Was everything within the deadline? Were you on time at every meeting, etc., etc.? All those points are also being graded. So ask for that form, so that you know from the start where to look after, or that you are certain that you are doing the right thing at the right time in the right way. Okay? So that's also really important. So let's talk about the scientific paper, the thesis. Basically, the most universities use the same format, which is the title page, the abstract, which you write at the very, very, very last time. That's really the closure of your thesis, so don't write that ahead. The introduction, the conceptual framework or the hypothesis development, the research design, the analysis and the results, the discussion, the appendices and the reference list. And a lot of times you also have to write a management summary. So let's talk about all those topics. First of all, the title page. This is the only page where you can leave some creativity. You can add a picture there, you can use a different font, but always on the title page you find the title of the thesis, the student name and student number, the study program, the academic year, the submission date, and the name of the supervisor. So that's the only page that you can use in a different format than the rest. Then the next page will be an abstract, which has a maximum of 200 words, and this is the part that you write at the very last, so I'll park that aside. Then the introduction, and this is a real important part. This is also most of the time the part where you start off with, because this is your rough ideas. You haven't done the complete theoretical reading and background for your theoretical framework, but you read a lot of papers, but not all of them, because during your writing you will read more and more and more. But the most important papers that you read will be in this introduction. The introduction the purpose of the introduction is that the reader get persuaded. So very often you start with a typical market trend. Did you notice that everywhere on the street you see this and this and that? And people react always like this and this and that. That's strange because in science we read that people are very blah 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 blah. So things are counterintuitive, for instance. You see this, but when we read the literature, we read this. Isn't that strange? How come? Why is that? That's kind of a gap that people who are not academic schooled, maybe they recognize it. Oh yes, I see that on the street indeed, or I see that in the business news, or I see that indeed. And then you open something which is questionable. Well, why is that? How come? So this is something that needs that the reader will have something like, I want to read further. After that, you start connecting the theoretical things that you read to that typical practical thing that you saw or that you see on the street or that you see happening on the news or whatever. And you start narrowing it down and you introduce the core variables. So for instance, group A, we see that group A reacts like this, while we read that they should react like this. And it's more for these products than for these products. But it also depends on, because that's something that we read. So you introduce all those variables of your conceptual framework, the draft, remember, that you already drawn. And then, at the end of page 2, you introduce your research objective. So not later than the second page, you introduce that research objective. After that, on page 3, you start discussing why it is important to figure out why this is happening or what is happening and why this is a gap in the literature and why is this a contribution for practitioners, for managers in business, and what is the contribution for scientists or for your academic purpose. Yeah, always those two, so scientific and practitioners. It's always good to have those both. And you will come back to that later on as well in your discussion, for instance, and in your management summary. So that's the introduction. Very hard to write. This will take you probably like 4, 5 or 6 drafts, and even when you're writing you still come back and add some and scrape some, etc., etc. Then your theoretical framework. So the theoretical framework is to help you write those hypotheses that you have. Let's say that you will have like 5 hypotheses. You always start with the easiest and the simplest, so that's just the independent variable on the dependent variable, but you have to write about that. So what, group A versus group B, why do you think that group A, look, this paper tells you that group A reacts like this paper tells the same, but this paper is a little bit different. So what's the connection between those 3, etc., etc. And the best way is just to take every variable, start at the left and take every variable and just write with the theoretical papers that you found in your own words, obviously. And it's really important that when you read a paper like that you try to interpret it by yourself and also always discuss how they did their research, because I'm sure that their research was on a totally different product, for instance, or in a totally different situation. So you have to write that down. So they did their research like this and this and this, and this came out. I think this reaction is the same because, in my case, because blah, 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 blah. But make sure that you always write the context of those researchers, because otherwise you cannot write down, so they write that it's like this, so I'm gonna assume that it will be the same in my situation. That's not the way to do it. Typical is 10 to 12 pages for your theoretical framework, and you end with your definite conceptual model. So then starts your research design. Now the research design is pretty complex because you have to be very, very, very specific how you are going to design your research. Why is it? Because the study needs to be replicable. So if we take just your thesis, we should be able to do exactly the same as you did. So what kind of data is collected? I'm assuming that you're going to do a survey. This is the easiest and the best way to do it. Well, why did you choose a survey? Why is this the best way to get an answer to all the questions that you have, all your hypotheses? Why did you make certain choices? Why did you do this sample and not that sample? Why did you choose students and not adults or whatever? Now, the research design is basically the same all over the world. We start with a method. So that's the real design. So it's a description of all your variables, what you measured, how you measured them, in what way that you did the survey, why did the survey, etc., etc. Then the participants, how many? What was their age? What was the gender? You also can always measure the means and the averages, etc. And really point out that these participants are a reliable test case for your survey. Then the procedure. And this is really, how did they receive the survey? It was digital send. Why by email? How am I sure that they are not manipulated? Were they all neutral? Did they receive an incentive for this or not? Why not? Why did they? And if they received an incentive, weren't they biased? So all these things you have to tackle to make sure, look, my survey is reliable, my data is reliable. We can assume that if we gather all this data, that everything that I discuss is based on a neutral group of people or participants. Then your stimulus material. I'm assuming that you're going to do a small kind of experiment, so you have to explain what stimulus you used. So for instance, this is the picture. I used this picture because in other studies I read that these kind of pictures always work like this. And this is the text. I chose this text. This is neutral, so that everything will be not biased. And this is an example. I tested it, etc., etc. So that's the stimulus material. Always based on theory, of course. And then the pretest. And the pretest is really, really important because you probably think, okay, I have my questionnaire. It all looks good. I read some books about it. This is the right way to do it. So I just can send it out for my main research. No, you have to pre-test it. It's really strict also in the rules that you have to pre-test, because when you get it back, you will see that people don't really act as you expected, that maybe the stimulus material didn't work out as you thought, maybe that if you use, for instance, Qualtrics, that your names in your questions weren't right. So in SPSS you get really strange, you cannot find your columns, etc. And you can all change it after your pre-test. So it's really important to do that pre-test and also to report how the results were. And if the results weren't perfect, what did you do to adjust them so that in your main study it will be all okay? Yes, so that's a pretty big part, and a lot of that goes to the appendix as well, especially when you're doing factor analysis, for instance, for skills or something, then you can explain that in your appendix. Then the measurements. So how were the groups randomized? Now, normally you let Qualtrics do the randomization, but you have to explain that when they are randomized, in what order do they get the questions, and which route did they take? Because if you, for instance, have one moderator with 2 products and 3 independent variables, you have 6 different groups. So all these 6 different groups, are they all the same size? Will they all also the gender was the same, and the ages, and etc. Now, that's something that you have in your measurements. And what's always good to write down is the pros and cons of your research design. For instance, okay, I could have chosen for a bigger sample, but I'm just a poor student and there wasn't enough time, but I know I should have more. So, okay, but I still think this is okay because blah, 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 blah. Pros and cons, you write them down in design, just to let the reader know that you know what you're doing. Okay, so you've sent out your main survey and now you have to wait for the response. But in the meantime, you already can start with writing down your analysis and results. You're probably assuming that they will react like this, react like that. So you also can write down which tests you will do. A NOVA test here, or a process by Hayes, or whatever. So if you just force yourself to write this down, this also makes you think, what do I need to write down here? And you will notice that when you start with this, even though you fill in some blanks, because also all these, how you write down your results is really complicated, but you also already can prepare that, and even you fill in crosses or blanks, just write them down. Okay, and I did an ANOVA test for this, I did a t-test for that, I did a MANOVA for this, and and write it down in a story kind of way. You already have some content there, and then when you get your data, it's just filling in the blanks. And maybe if something reacts different than you expected, you have to change it. But still, just to force yourself thinking about what am I gonna write down here per hypothesis. Now, and if you have your data, you start with the topics. Most of the time you start with your manipulation check and your covariates. Your covariates are your age, your gender, for instance, or maybe where the people come from, states, or whatever. So you first write down those covariates and how they are divided between the different groups, and that's all set. And if we're all good and all the manipulation checks went okay, then we're going to test the hypothesis. And the hypothesis, we just test them per hypothesis. So we start with number 1, then number 2, then number 3, then number 4, then number 5. And number 5 is most of the time the whole complete model. And that's where you end up. But you have to take it in steps, just as you did at your theoretical framework. You also took them in steps. The reader, you took them, this is hypothesis 1, this is 2, this is 3, and you took them through the theory. So this is also the same way as you do your analysis and your results. Now, I personally really like to work with process by Hayes. Most of the time you do a multiple regression analysis with 2 independent variables and a dependent variable, and it has an effect with some moderators. And you can put them all in one model process, which is an add-on in your SPSS, and then the whole bunch rolls out. If you have that complete data file, then you know which results you will have and which are significant and which aren't. And then after that, you can spotlight some certain parts, because you do want to make some tables in your analysis and results. You want to show some tables. Look, this is group A, this is group B, this is the effect, this is the interaction effect. And sometimes you need to make some ANOVAs in your SPSS to spotlight that certain result. But next to that, if you can, just use process by Hayes, and you have everything in one data file, which is really nice. And after that, you can spotlight or highlight certain parts. We call that simple effect tests. If you have done all that, then you start with the conclusion of the hypothesis. So just the main conclusion, these are the results of the hypothesis, this is what I found in my data file. And after that, you do some explorative analysis. And the explorative analysis is the questions that arise while you were working on the data. You thought like, I question, why is this? And how come they react like this? You didn't have a hypothesis about that question, but you still wonder why. For instance, is age an effect? Or do people in cities react different than other people from other parts in the world, or in the town, or in towns, or whatever? So maybe there are some covariates or some questions that you have that arose during your analysis, and those are the ones that you can use in your explorative analysis. It's very personal, that part. So I cannot really suggest what you do there, but it's just depending on your thesis. And then in the end, you have your discussion and your theoretical and your management implication or your implications. And this part provides an answer to the main research objective, obviously, for which you have formulated in your introduction. Don't be too pretentious, because yes, all the data, so it's a fact that is a fact that, and I know everything now because I did this. But also don't be too modest. Somewhere in between. You can be pretty strong in your words, like, okay, so we figured out this, so the results tell us this and this, which is in line with the theory, or which is different than we thought, or whatever. But be really strong, but not too pretentious. But it needs to be strong, because you did a lot of research and you worked a lot on this, and it's an academic paper, so yeah, let the figures do the talking. Address the key findings that you have in your paper, the limitations of your study, which was also a kind of in your pros and cons, suggestions, of course, for further research, which you didn't find out. Maybe some questions were open in your explorative results. And of course, the managerial and or the societal implications for practitioners and for scientists. Okay, always those two are very important to mention them both. So for practitioners, if you have a brand, if you have such a brand with the intentions for brands, blah, 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 then use this or do this or never do that. And for scientists, it will be, there's a new theoretical framework, there's a new, we discovered a new theory, we filled a gap which wasn't filled before, etc. Now the appendices, this is often where you find pre-test results, or maybe some factor analysis, or your survey, for instance, your survey flow, some pictures which you use for the manipulation, all these kind of things, you put them in appendices, and you really have good references in your master thesis where to find these. Keep the same layout as the main manuscript, and use letters A, B, C, D, etc. After that, you find a reference list, which was generated automatically, for instance by Microsoft Word or a different program, but it has to be automatically generated. I personally really like to use Microsoft Word because it works perfect, but some people like to also save the papers, the journals, together with the references, and there are really good programs which are inserts for your Microsoft Word. But it has to be automatically generated. And then, a lot of universities also ask a management summary. And the management summary is a little bit easier to read for non-academics. So this is more like the word already says it, for the management, for practitioners, easy to read, but it has the same facts and figures as your manuscript, but then in 2 pages with the main results and the main findings and why it's so relevant for them to read the manuscript or the management summary. And all the results are there, of course. Now, if you have done all this, then you write your abstract. And your abstract is so important, but you have read so many abstracts probably already for all the papers in top journals that you have read. So you know what kind of is the idea of an abstract, and it's a really personal signature to your manuscript. So make sure it's a maximum of 200 words. Make sure that you have the catchy first 2 phrases must be very catching. What have you done to find out what you have found? So the results and the answer to your question is completely in that abstract. And it's a really personal thing, so I cannot really advise you how to write an abstract. And there are millions of books and examples where you can find good abstracts, but it's so personal that I not really can advise you. The only advice that I can give you is that it is the very last thing that you do, because now you know exactly what the results are, how you wrote it down, and you are really confident with all the results. And it's really a nice thing to write in the last week, for instance, before your deadline. It will flow out of your pen like that. So I hope this video was kind of valuable for you, and I wish you a good luck with writing your thesis. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.